In the affluent town of Rosewood, nestled in the heart of the Midwest, 50-year-old Claire Bennett's life appeared to be a glossy portrait of success. Rosewood, with its tree-lined streets and grandiose homes, was a place where appearances mattered. Claire's sprawling estate, with its manicured lawns and classic architecture, was a testament to the wealth and influence of her family. Claire was a former real estate agent whose career had once thrived, securing high-profile deals and cementing her reputation as a savvy businesswoman. However, the years had taken their toll. The excitement and challenges of her past career had given way to a more predictable, though still comfortable, existence. Claire's husband, Richard Bennett, 53, was a successful businessman whose ventures had made him a pillar of the community. His position required long hours, which led to a growing distance between him and Claire. While Richard was often praised for his accomplishments and generosity, at home he was increasingly absent, both physically and emotionally. The once vibrant romance between Claire and Richard had faded into a distant memory, leaving Claire feeling more isolated than ever. Claire and Richard had 2 children, both now grown and living away from home. Their departure had left Claire and Richard alone in their large house, amplifying the sense of emptiness that had begun to settle in Claire's life. She had tried to fill this void with charity work and social engagements, but these activities failed to provide the fulfillment she so desperately sought. Beneath her composed exterior, Claire wrestled with a growing dissatisfaction, a sense of living a life that, despite its outward perfection, felt deeply unfulfilled. Claire's growing frustration found an outlet during a charity event at the Rosewood Art Gallery. The gallery, known for showcasing local talent, was hosting a fundraiser for underprivileged youth, a cause Claire had been passionately involved with. The event was a display of opulence and good intentions, with guests mingling over champagne and hors d'oeuvres, their conversations filled with superficial pleasantries. It was during this event that Claire first encountered Jake Miller, an 18-year-old artist who had recently moved to Rosewood. Jake was unlike anyone Claire had met in years. With his tousled hair, intense blue eyes, and a demeanor that radiated youthful passion, Jake stood out in the crowd of well-heeled patrons. He had been introduced as one of the featured artists, his works displayed prominently on the gallery's walls. His art was vibrant and raw, a stark contrast to the polished, safe creations of the other local artists. Claire found herself inexplicably drawn to Jake. Their initial conversation was casual, but there was an undeniable spark between them. Jake's youthful energy and enthusiasm for his craft captivated Claire, offering a stark contrast to the mundanity of her life. Jake spoke with an intensity and honesty that Claire found refreshing and oddly invigorating. As the evening progressed, Claire and Jake found themselves in a secluded corner of the gallery, away from the prying eyes of the other guests. Their conversation deepened, touching on topics that Claire had not discussed in years. They spoke of dreams, fears, and the constraints imposed by societal expectations. Jake's candidness was disarming, and Claire felt a connection that she hadn't experienced in a long time. This initial meeting marked the beginning of a relationship that would come to redefine Claire's life. Over the next few weeks, Claire and Jake's interactions grew more frequent and intimate. They began to meet outside the gallery, their encounters filled with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Claire was acutely aware of the risks involved. The affair she was embarking on was fraught with potential dangers, but the allure of Jake's youth and the escape he offered from her stifling existence was too tempting to resist. Claire's home life became increasingly strained as she tried to juggle her newfound passion with the demands of her daily routine. Richard, oblivious to Claire's infidelity, continued his routine of long hours and social obligations. Their interactions, once marked by warmth and affection, had become increasingly strained. Richard's detachment only served to heighten Claire's feelings of isolation and discontent. Claire's affair with Jake remained hidden from the world, but the thrill of their secret meetings was tempered by a gnawing sense of guilt and apprehension. The secrecy of their relationship added a layer of excitement, but it also weighed heavily on Claire's conscience. She found herself caught between the desire for the exhilaration Jake provided and the growing realization of the potential consequences of their actions. As Claire and Jake's relationship deepened, so did the complexity of their situation. Claire's life, once marked by a facade of perfection, began to crack under the pressure of her double life. The meetings with Jake, filled with passion and intensity, became a temporary escape from the monotony and dissatisfaction that had begun to define Claire's existence. The arrival of a new and vibrant presence in Claire's life created a sharp contrast to the emptiness she felt at home. Jake's influence brought both a sense of liberation and a looming threat to her carefully curated world. As their relationship progressed, Claire became increasingly aware of the delicate balance she was trying to maintain. The thrill of the affair was overshadowed by the fear of being discovered and the potential fallout from her actions. The chapter closes with Claire standing at the precipice of a life-altering decision. The excitement of her affair with Jake was now tinged with the anxiety of its potential consequences. The seemingly perfect life she had built was beginning to unravel, and the choices she made in the coming days would determine the fate of her marriage, her reputation, and her future. In this seemingly idyllic town, where appearances often masked underlying turmoil, Claire Bennett's world was about to be shaken by the choices she made in pursuit of a fleeting sense of fulfillment. The stage was set for a drama that would reveal the dark undercurrents of desire, secrecy, and betrayal that lay hidden beneath the surface of her seemingly perfect life. As the weeks passed, Claire Bennett found herself sinking deeper into the labyrinth of her secret relationship with Jake Miller. Their once sporadic meetings became a regular part of Claire's routine, each encounter adding a layer of complexity to her already tangled life. Despite the thrill Jake provided, the constant need to conceal their affair began to weigh heavily on Claire. Claire's secret rendezvous with Jake became more frequent and more intense. They would meet in secluded parks, dimly lit cafes, and occasionally at Jake's small apartment, which was cluttered with canvases and paintbrushes. These moments of escape from the suffocating mundanity of her life with Richard offered Claire a brief but intense reprieve. Jake's youthful exuberance and artistic passion provided Claire with a sense of exhilaration that she desperately craved. They talked for hours, shared intimate moments, and dreamed of a future far removed from the constraints of their current lives. Claire's growing obsession with Jake led her to make increasingly irrational decisions. She began to prioritize their meetings over her family obligations, often making excuses to avoid social events and family gatherings. Her actions did not go unnoticed by Richard, who had started to sense a shift in his wife's behavior. He noticed her frequent absences, her distracted demeanor, and her growing irritability. Though he couldn't quite pinpoint the cause, Richard's suspicions grew, adding a layer of tension to their already strained relationship. One evening, after a particularly heated argument with Richard, Claire retreated to one of her favorite secluded spots, a small, tranquil park on the outskirts of town. This was where she had planned to meet Jake that night. The park was serene, its shadows dancing under the soft glow of street lamps. Claire arrived early, her mind racing as she tried to shake off the frustration of her argument with Richard. Jake arrived shortly after, his presence a welcome relief to Claire's frazzled nerves. Their conversation quickly turned to a passionate discussion about their future together, with Jake expressing his desire for a more open relationship. He was growing increasingly impatient with the secrecy and the emotional strain it was placing on both of them. Claire, already on edge, struggled to keep the conversation light and positive. She feared Jake's growing frustration might lead to a revelation that could expose their affair. Their interaction became heated as Jake pressed Claire for a commitment that she was not ready to make. The conversation turned into a confrontation, with Jake demanding to know why Claire couldn't openly be with him. His voice rose in frustration, drawing the attention of a few passers-by. Claire, her anxiety reaching a breaking point, attempted to deflect the conversation, but Jake's insistence only fueled her fear. She was acutely aware of the potential fallout if their affair were to come to light, and Jake's demands were pushing her to the edge. Meanwhile, Richard's suspicions had led him to hire a private investigator, a decision he made after noticing inconsistencies in Claire's stories and growing increasingly concerned about her behavior. The investigator, a grizzled veteran with a knack for uncovering hidden truths, began to follow Claire discreetly. His observations were meticulous, documenting Claire's movements and interactions with a keen eye. The investigator's reports revealed a pattern of frequent, unexplained absences and meetings at unusual hours, but he had yet to uncover the true nature of Claire's activities. One day, as Claire prepared for another secret meeting with Jake, she received a phone call from Richard, who had noticed her absence from a family event. His voice was tinged with frustration and concern. Claire, scrambling to maintain her facade, made up a story about a last-minute charity obligation. Richard was not convinced, but Claire managed to deflect his inquiries with practiced ease. That evening, Claire and Jake met at a secluded cabin that Jake had rented for a weekend getaway. The cabin, nestled in the woods, provided a private retreat away from prying eyes. They had planned this escape as a way to reconnect and discuss their future without the constant fear of being discovered. The weekend was meant to be a respite from their stressful lives, but it soon became clear that their emotional turmoil was far from resolved. The intimacy of the cabin only served to heighten the intensity of their interactions. Claire and Jake's conversations were filled with a mix of passion, regret, and fear. Jake's demands for more commitment were met with Claire's increasing anxiety. Their emotional exchanges grew more intense, with Jake expressing his frustration at the lack of progress in their relationship. Claire, torn between her desire for Jake and her fear of the consequences, struggled to maintain control of the situation. Their discussions often turned into heated arguments, with Jake's frustration leading to emotional outbursts. Claire's attempts to calm him down were met with resistance, and the emotional strain of their relationship began to take its toll on both of them. The cabin, once a symbol of their escape, became a pressure cooker of emotions, with both Claire and Jake struggling to navigate the complex dynamics of their affair. During their stay, the tension between Claire and Jake reached a boiling point. Jake's demands for a public acknowledgement of their relationship were met with Claire's growing desperation to keep their affair hidden. Their interactions became increasingly volatile, with both of them resorting to irrational behavior. The fear of discovery and the emotional intensity of their relationship created a volatile environment, leading to a series of arguments that further strained their already fragile bond. As the weekend drew to a close, Claire and Jake returned to Rosewood, their relationship more strained than ever. Claire's fear of discovery intensified, and her attempts to conceal their affair became more desperate. The investigators' reports had become more detailed, revealing the increasing frequency of Claire's absences and the suspicious nature of her meetings. Richard's suspicions were growing, and he became more determined to uncover the truth about his wife's behavior. Back in Rosewood, the tension in Claire's life was palpable. Her interactions with Richard became more strained, with Richard's growing frustration and concern only adding to Claire's anxiety. She found herself caught in a web of deception, with the risk of exposure looming over her every decision. The secret of her affair with Jake was becoming increasingly difficult to manage, and Claire's attempts to keep her life from falling apart were becoming more desperate and erratic. The chapter closes with Claire standing on the precipice of a life-altering decision. The pressure of maintaining her secret, combined with the escalating tensions in her relationships, had created a situation fraught with danger. The seemingly perfect life she had built was beginning to crumble under the weight of her choices, and the consequences of her actions were becoming increasingly unavoidable. In the quiet of her home, Claire faced the harsh reality of her situation. The thrill of her affair with Jake was now overshadowed by the fear of discovery and the mounting pressure to keep her secrets hidden. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation, with Claire's carefully constructed life on the brink of collapse. The choices she made in the coming days would determine the fate of her marriage, her reputation, and her future. The quiet of the secluded cabin had been a fleeting escape for Claire Bennett and Jake Miller, but it had done little to alleviate the mounting tension between them. As they returned to the real world of Rosewood, their relationship was in a precarious state. The emotional and psychological strain had reached a breaking point, and the walls of their world were closing in. Claire's sense of urgency grew as she struggled to maintain the delicate balance between her life with Richard and her secret affair with Jake. Her attempts to keep their relationship hidden were becoming increasingly difficult, with the private investigator's reports indicating a pattern of suspicious behavior. Claire's anxiety about being discovered only fueled the instability in her interactions with Jake, making their once passionate encounters increasingly fraught with tension. One cold evening, Jake confronted Claire in a secluded park where they had frequently met. The park was deserted, with only the rustling of the trees and the distant hum of city lights breaking the silence. Jake's frustration was palpable, his patience worn thin by Claire's continued refusal to acknowledge their relationship publicly. He demanded a clear answer, whether she would commit to him fully or end the affair. Claire, already on edge from the growing pressure in her life, struggled to provide a satisfactory response. The argument between Claire and Jake escalated quickly. Their voices rose in anger, their words filled with hurt and betrayal. Claire attempted to calm Jake down, but his emotions were overpowering. The confrontation drew the attention of a passing jogger, who glanced over but chose to continue on their way, sensing the intensity of the situation. In a moment of uncontrolled fury, Jake pushed Claire against a tree. Claire's heart raced as she struggled to maintain her composure. Desperate to defuse the situation, she grabbed a nearby stick, intending to use it as a means of self-defense. Jake, noticing her sudden movement, reacted impulsively. The confrontation grew violent, and in the heat of the moment, Claire swung the stick at Jake. The impact was accidental but severe, causing Jake to fall to the ground. Unconscious, Claire's immediate reaction was one of shock and panic. She crouched beside Jake, her hands trembling as she checked for a pulse. The reality of what had just occurred began to sink in, and Claire was overwhelmed by a wave of horror and guilt. Jake lay motionless, and Claire's mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. With a mixture of fear and desperation, Claire decided to flee the scene. She left Jake lying in the park, trying to push the image of his lifeless body from her mind. Her heart pounded as she drove home, her thoughts clouded by a haze of panic and dread. She had just committed an act she could never undo, and the weight of her actions pressed heavily on her conscience. As Claire arrived at her home, she was met by Richard, who had been growing increasingly concerned about her erratic behavior. Richard's frustration had reached a peak, and he confronted Claire about her continued absences and the growing distance between them. Claire, still reeling from the events of the evening, attempted to deflect Richard's questions with feigned calmness. She avoided eye contact and was evasive in her responses, her mind preoccupied with the aftermath of the confrontation with Jake. The next morning, the news of Jake Miller's disappearance spread through Rosewood. The town was abuzz with speculation and concern, with residents discussing the case in hushed tones. The police launched an investigation, and the private investigator hired by Richard began to piece together the clues surrounding Jake's disappearance. The investigator's findings led to a mounting suspicion surrounding Claire. The investigator had noted Claire's recent patterns of behavior and her unexplained absences, and he began to connect the dots. The investigation revealed inconsistencies in Claire's alibis and traces of her presence in locations tied to Jake. The police questioned Claire, and though she maintained her innocence, her responses were marked by nervousness and evasiveness. The mounting evidence against her began to take its toll, and Claire's once secure world started to crumble. Richard, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, struggled to reconcile the woman he thought he knew with the evidence of her infidelity and potential involvement in Jake's disappearance. The investigation intensified as the police conducted searches of the areas Claire had frequented, including the park where Jake had been found. Forensic evidence and witness statements slowly began to paint a picture of Claire's involvement. The initial assumption of a voluntary disappearance shifted towards the possibility of foul play, and Claire's life became the focus of intense scrutiny. Desperate to cover her tracks, Claire attempted to distance herself from the investigation. She avoided talking about Jake and tried to maintain a facade of normalcy in her interactions with Richard and the authorities. However, the pressure of the investigation and the mounting evidence against her became overwhelming. Claire's attempts to conceal her involvement only made her look more suspicious. As the police closed in on her, Claire reached a breaking point. The weight of her actions and the impending consequences of her decisions began to bear down on her. She struggled with the reality of the situation she had created, her once perfect life now shattered beyond repair. The dramatic climax occurred when Claire was finally confronted by the police at her home. They had gathered enough evidence to arrest her, and the gravity of the situation was unmistakable. Claire was taken into custody, her life and future now uncertain. The arrest was a public spectacle, with reporters and townsfolk gathering outside her home, eager for updates on the high-profile case. The trial that followed was a media sensation, with Claire's affair with Jake and the details of his death becoming the focus of public interest. The courtroom drama unfolded with Claire's once stable life laid bare for all to see. Her defense tried to argue that the confrontation with Jake had been a tragic accident, but the evidence and testimonies against her were damning. The jury deliberated for hours, and when they returned with a verdict, it was clear that Claire's fate had been sealed. She was found guilty of manslaughter. Verdict that carried a lengthy prison sentence. The courtroom was filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow as the reality of Claire's actions settled over those who had followed the case. In the aftermath of the trial, Claire's life was irrevocably changed. The facade of her perfect life had been stripped away, revealing the deep-seated issues and personal struggles that had led to her downfall. The once respected figure in Rosewood was now a cautionary tale of obsession, betrayal, and the consequences of living a double life. As Claire began her prison sentence, she reflected on the choices that had led her to this point. The thrill of her affair with Jake had ultimately cost her everything she held dear, leaving her with the stark realization of the price she had paid for her pursuit of excitement and escape. The story of Claire Bennett became a somber reminder of the fragile nature of happiness and the destructive potential of unbridled desire. In the quiet confines of her prison cell, Claire came to terms with the reality of her actions. The perfect life she had once known was now a distant memory, replaced by the harsh and unforgiving reality of her new existence. The consequences of her choices had reshaped her world, and the lessons learned from her downfall would forever haunt her in the years to come.